night. It's a great pleasure to introduce Gaspar Miklós Tamás, who is professor at the Central European University in Budapest, who is a fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna, and his talk here is part of our program of cooperation between the Vienna Institute and the Graduate Institute here. Professor Tamás was born in Transylvania. He went to Hungary in 1978. He has had many lives. He has been a member of parliament. He has been a director of the Institute of Philosophy of the Hungarian Academy of Sciences. He has been at both a pro-European and an anti-European. In short, he has been a dissident all his life in different guises. The subject of his talk today is Viktor Orban and the New Central Europe, and I look forward to hearing him. Professor Tamás.
Thank you. You have now persuaded me that I should be either pro-European or anti-European. I haven't come around to do that until now, but I will. I promise you. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for having me tonight. And since Hungary and part of East Central Europe has been exhaustively treated in the press in the last time, I'll try not to bore you with things that you will know anyway. And so I'll just present a few points that I think are characteristic of contemporary new East Central Europe, but which to a certain extent are beginning to be characteristic of the whole of Europe, because if there is one signal merit or conspicuous sign of the greatness of the Prime Minister of my country, is that he has been the first in many ways and in many respects. And when he says sometimes that the world is now emulating him, he's right. He's right. This is exactly what is happening. The world is emulating him, and he has been indeed, if you wish, the pioneer of some developments, some, not all, obviously, of some developments in the world, not because it was his influence, but he was the early bird who caught the worm, and he caught it, and so did we. And the thing is that indeed it has been Mr. Orbán has been an innovative, original, and bold politician, certainly an historical figure. Nobody can deny it. He's really important, and his name will remain in the history books. And he, most certainly he and the people similar to him, are most certainly not the way they are sometimes characterized. And I will go exactly without any further ado in some of the specific elements of the new regimes in East Central Europe that are, I think, misunderstood, both in the press and in some scholarly treatments of the region. First, I have my very profound doubts about the kind of liberal criticism that being still intellectually in the Cold War. And Cold War liberalism has indeed had its historical importance, and it has influenced all of us, and even its enemies. Even the enemies have been indeed, the paradigm of totalitarianism, the paradigm of the West being the inheritor of the great civilizations and cultural values, and etc., etc., etc. So, because this was habit forming, and indeed Cold War liberalism, which indeed in the long decades of ideological fight with the Soviet Union has indeed had very important merits, the ideas formed by it are being inherited today, and today I think they are quite an impediment to the true understanding of what's going on. Because you see, most of it, what we read about the new system, are how similar they are to the pre-89 centralizing, statist, one-party systems. Well, rubbish. This is absolutely untrue. They're not at all similar. These are really quite original systems, and let me just try to characterize it, starting from the example of Hungary, how these systems really work. You see, the Bolshevik systems of various descriptions, Stalinist, post-Stalinist, Maoist, Titoist, this and that and other, had some formal characteristics that were really similar. It was indeed a system. Those systems were ideologically positivistic and rational. And because they were indeed centralizing and statist, because of course they had to replace the mediation, economic mediation of the market with state planning, this meant, of course, that these systems have been extremely given to calculation, to mathematics. Can you imagine? We had, for example, in all Eastern Bloc countries, we had, the central planning office. They had to calculate the prices compared to needs, etc., 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 of tens of thousands of commodities. It had its own mathematical methods. It used tens of thousands of intellectuals. This was a system that used economists, statisticians, engineers, and intellectuals, a vast number of the intellectual class, that was partly created, but most certainly was needed by the system. And of course, there's another aspect too, because of course the system needed, as all political systems do, needed a sort of a transcendent legitimacy, like all systems do, which is beyond their empirical and day-to-day frameworks, and the transcendent element of the state socialist post-Stalin systems was, of course, culture. It was culture. The cult of the arts, the cult of learning, the cult of a bookish learning has replaced, or at least it attempted to replace, the church. It was lay culture, poetry and music, and in Hungary's case, no philosophy, but in other countries, yes, but mostly arts, literature, and so on and so forth. Hundreds of thousands and millions of people have been reading high literature. There was no other entertainment. We were forced to live a very highfalutin and very select life from a cultural point of view. As a young boy, I couldn't read trash because it didn't exist. So I was forced to read Stendhal and Dostoevsky and Goethe, No, that wasn't so bad. And so this kind of rationalistic, intellectual, dry, puritanical, centralizing, and really statist character, with his great dream of being a rational society, has not been inherited. At first, the liberal Aufbruch, the liberal drive that has inspired many of the changes around 89 in all East European countries, of course, had gone back to the romantic roots of liberalism, a cult of the personality, of individuality, of originality, of creativity, that has been, of course, also mixed and combined with the idea of enterprise, like in Schumpeter's idea of the heroic entrepreneur, and so on and so forth. So at the beginning, you see, the rigid, puritanical, centralizing, and of course, dictatorial system of old has been replaced by a new form of life that didn't last, a new form of life that extolled the virtues of individualism. of romantic individualism, which is, in a way, it's our national tradition. Romantic individualism has been, of course, the great inspiration behind most of European liberalism in the 19th century. This is what we inherited from our literature, Hungarian literature and other literatures we read in translations from Russian and translations from the German. Mostly these two have been, of course, influential in those times. I mean, Dostoevsky and Tolstoy and Turgenev and so on. Now, but you see, on these individualistic basis, when the economic collapse and the ideological disappointment had come towards the end of the 1990s, it would have been absolutely impossible to recreate a system that had been indeed identified with servitude and with dictatorship and with immobility. The new quasi-authoritarian systems created by the younger generation, that is younger than me, it doesn't mean young, they are now in their 40s and 50s, and I'm in my late 60s, and very late 60s, and you see these people, when they wanted to change their world and go against the grain that it seemed to them was a sort of a Western-inspired liberalism of sorts, they could not go back to a rationalism they neither knew nor cared for. Because the new system, the present system, is based on improvisation, on Willkür, on what the great legal scholar Ernst Frenkel called in the 1930s the Maßnahmenstaat, as opposed, state of measures, as opposed to the legal state. This is based on a great belief on the force of the individual. But in this case, of course, is the individuality and the personality of the leader. Mr. Orban keeps speaking of the strong leader. That is his ideal. And he is a strong leader. And so is Mr. Kaczynski. And so are others. Not all of them. Some people just would like to be strong leaders, like Mr. Babiš, but he won't ever be one. And others. But so what is happening? What is happening is not that, there's nationalization of the private economy or nationalization of the media or something. No. It is much more cunning, much more interesting, much more original, much more creative, and much more terrible. And because what is happening is a rejuvenation, a recreation of the ancient system of royal donations. What did our ancient noble kings do? In the 13th and 14th centuries, during the patrimonial kingdom, they were recompensating their faithful barons with castles and fortresses and lands of the crown. Property of the crown was something in which the property of the state and the personal property of the ruler were not yet carefully distinguished. Well, nor are these assets now in contemporary East Central Europe carefully distinguished. So, for example, when our Prime Minister has bought through middlemen 198 media outlets in one single day. Well, he didn't do this as a prime minister. He has friends, capitalist friends, who will buy these things up, of course, with state credits. So it is a state action, and it isn't. It is under the influence of the prime minister, but it's not under state influence. These are not state media. These media, that's just an example. These media are owned by the private company. Everybody knows, of course, and nobody will deny it, that these are private companies, at the back of which is the ruling group in society, but not in their capacity as the constitutional and the legal leaders of the country, but as private persons who at the same time happen to possess state power. So the informal side of the exercise of power is much more significant than its formal exercise. Mr. Orban, Mr. Kaczynski and the others are not trying to get various spheres of social life and economic life and political life under the state authority, but yes, under their informal power. Assets, powers, mechanisms, etc., actually, what is happening is the spheres and levels of state power and state authority and state institutions are outsourced to various autonomous institutions, foundations, private companies, etc., and they will actually indirectly exercise power. Such phenomena exist elsewhere too, I know. It is not Hungary only where the laws are written by private lawyers' firms. It happens in America too. And, but of course it is not the Ministry of Justice where the legal texts are written. It is not the Academy of Sciences where the manuals for kids are written. These are all private companies, foundations, institutions uncontrolled by the legally constituted constitutional state power, but at the same time controlled by those who have that power, but in their capacity of private persons. It's a very subtle system. It's a very subtle system because you see, all the critics are looking for Bolshevik methods, but they won't find them because they don't exist. These are not Bolshevik methods at all. The Bolshevik methods were exactly the opposite of this. They were really centralizing and really statist and really aimed at the power of the single party. But do we have a single party? No, we have no party. And because, political parties in Eastern Europe, in most, not all, in all, but in most East European countries, are just reduced now to small apparatus groups and of professionals. There are no movements. There are exceptions. Poland, for example, where the dominant party has the character of a movement as well. But this is not typical of other East Central European countries. And so you see, this is a system in which informality, improvisation, capricious and whimsical exercise of power by an informal group of men, usually a group of men close to one another, also characterized in Hungary without anybody observing this is what the press is worth, what I'm talking like Trump, and I shouldn't. But for example, because we have a government in Hungary, which is a Catholic country, a government that is almost exclusively Protestant. It's a government of Calvinists. Of 11 cabinet ministers, 9 are Calvinists. And the majority of the important state secretaries too. And Calvinists are around 10% of the population. But because it's an irreligious country, people won't notice. But it means that it could have happened in another way too. But the thing is that these people are friends from the same sort of small town. We went to the same college. It is very much an informal group of friends and of fellow oligarchs. Now, they were quite poor, nice students. I knew them very well at the time. And you see, this is the main characteristic of the regime. This is not a totalitarian dictatorship imposing state rule on everything and everybody. Not at all. Not at all. No. But of course, something will have to keep all this society together because the bureaucracy isn't. There have been mass firings of bureaucrats and civil servants and state intellectuals in the last time under the slogan of anti-bureaucratic struggle and so on and so forth. But the communists did also always struggle against bureaucracy, but they never did anything about this. But these systems do. And And so what they need to keep the whole business together is a double-edged movement. One is to keep the remaining formal institutions of the state paralyzed. Courts of law, you know, the state controller's office, universities, etc., etc., etc. I'll tell you an example, again, of Hungary. That's the most characteristic, most typical, and most entertaining, if you wish. You know, traditionally, there's an institution in all these countries that has a great authority in this country. That's the Academy of Sciences. This was not to be born. That an autonomous state institution, also generously paid from the state coffers traditionally, a fellow of the Hungarian Academy of Sciences earns more than a minister, and so he should, mostly he, but so they should. And so this was not to be born, so Mr. Orban has discovered that there was a little private club in Hungary, a very conservative private club, that happened to call itself the Hungarian Academy of Arts. But it was no academy, it was a private club, private discussion club of some conservative artists, mostly but not exclusively unknown. And he introduced this group into the constitution of the state as being an important state institution, and most of the artistic and literary life and exhibitions, museums, etc., have been subordinated to this nice private club of, you know, nice old people, and they gave them even more than what the normal academicians have earned. But that means that a nice, quite, in a way, attractive club of old geezers such as myself gets this fantastic power, and no basis whatsoever, no logic, nothing. Also, very important state institutions are simply liquidated. So it's not only the courts about which, you know, the papers will report, but why isn't there authority of protection of monuments any longer in Hungary? Why there's a no land survey? Why isn't there an office for the environment? All these things have been simply closed down. They don't exist any longer. Many things, archives, etc., are closing down. You know, museums are planned to be moved from one place to another. Meanwhile, they are not open, etc., etc. There's no logic to it, but it keeps everybody on their toes. The constant reorganization, which means absolute uncertainty for the middle class, for the, you know, employed middle class, not the entrepreneurs, and not the bourgeoisie, the middle class. And that means, of course, a great dependence on the state? No, on the central ruling group. But where is that group? The membership of that group cannot be ascertained. It's all informal. How can you be in such a system? How can you be loyal? To whom? What should you do in order to prove your usefulness and your loyalty? Well, in part, you will evince ideological loyalty and faith and fidelity. And there are a few points on which you are supposed to be loyal. But the state doesn't really have a true state ideology. It is a concatenation of gestures and of various moves, all improvised. And so everybody has to be very alert to being loyal to God knows who, and God knows in what. It is very mysterious, very interesting. And you see, also people say in the press and again in political science exercises of various kinds that the ideology of this system is nationalism. Well, it isn't. Well, it isn't at all. Traditional nationalism, and this is the only kind we have, traditional nationalism comes, of course, in two guises. You know, it has been described in the 19th century by German scholars, very great for classifications, cultural nationalism and state nationalism, as it's well known. That's, modern nationalisms are a combination of the two. And Hungarian nationalism is no exception. And in this respect, of course, even under the so-called socialist system, there has been such a nationalism, as indeed it has been regularized by officialdom from the 1940s, from the late 1940s. In the case of Hungary, in the writings of József Révai, who has been, the great inspirer for sort of a communist nationalism in Hungary. Our history was always a fight for national independence against the Habsburgs and such nonsense. And so you see, this kind of nationalism that extolled the virtues and the harmony and the unity of the nation was basically, of course, as it was, a democratic theory that is based, of course, we are in Geneva, on Rousseau's theory of the people, in which the togetherness of the citizens and of the members of the national community would transcend other aspects, such as race, class, and gender. And so modern nationalism has been indeed an intellectual instrument aimed at uniting a community. And it did quite successfully in some instances, unite that community, and that has its own style, its own culture. It is, the remnants of old classical patriotism, in which you sacrifice many private things to the good of the fatherland, etc. So you all know this. We are all taught that in our respective schools, in whichever European country you may have been born. But this is not that. This is not that. This is a multifaceted, well, of course, elements of nationalism survive, but it's a combination of a multifaceted xenophobia, mostly directed against the West, which in a comical way now is mostly represented by Germany. Well, Germany has been considered a Western country only in the last 30 years. Before, Germans didn't know that they were a Western nation. They were always Mitteleuropa, weren't they? Militant German nationalism was always addressed its hostility to the West. It wasn't, and this was not ever, considered to be a Western nation. That's a novelty. That's a very important novelty. And now this is the epitome of the Western nations, which is, one of the most amusing historical twists you can imagine. And so, it is not Mr. Soros who is the most hated person in Hungary. Of course not, quite. The most hated person in Hungary, on the right, of course, is Angela Merkel. And of course, and the distant second is Pope Francis. And yes, he's much hated, much hated on the right, really passionately and deeply hated. And look at any comments rubric in any Hungarian newspaper. And he's a Jewish homosexual Bolshevik, as we all know, and no doubt about that. And you see, pedophile too. And the thing is that this multifaceted xenophobia, of course, it's personifying some features and some aspects of ourselves, projected on the outside. For example, we all know, I can see some Hungarian faces in the audience, I can tell. You see Hungarians and also Poles and others, Serbs, etc., are not exactly the most disciplined and obedient persons. We are very independent and go only after our, as Hungarians say, we are going after our own noses. And so you see, this of course, because we have this authoritarian state, this is not okay any longer. It has to be shown that this kind of autonomous behavior and undisciplined behavior and no respect for authority and no obedience is a foreign and it is somehow culpable, it is sinful. It is leading to a frittering away of the national unity, which it isn't actually. It hasn't in the last 400 years. And so on and so forth. And of course, the whole thing is very much increasing. On the one hand is the classical extreme right-wing conspiracy theory, etc., the we know who's who are doing the we know what, and nobody actually knows who they are and what they're doing, but we're pretending that we know. And that's one thing. And the second is the first real introduction of classical Western-style racism into the political culture of Eastern Europe. Because you see, you didn't quite hear before in Eastern Europe that blacks, that didn't exist and still don't, in Eastern Europe are somehow inferior people. You didn't have thousands of comments under an article about the movement Black Lives Matter in the United States. All of it hostile to the blacks, in a way with the terminology I have never run across in my life, the hatred of unknown blacks. But this is not a systematic worldview and a centrally imposed ideology. This is an element of a political mood and of a political culture from which this ruling group can retreat at any time. And it might. And it might. It's absolutely not sure. Actually, I think that they will keep this because it's very successful, but otherwise they will be able to retreat from this. You see, so we have, in a way, we have a strange system, which is, of course, a capitalist. And because of the ruling group's disposal of a large swath of the economic life, people say that this is nationalization, this is not genuine capitalism. Well, most of capitalism is like this. True market capitalism with true individualism is an exception in history. It has existed in 19th century England, for example, and it still exists here and there in spots. But a combination of oligarchic rule, of state interference, of traditional authority, of corruption and crime, and of territorial control, etc., etc., was always the case in most societies since the 17th century. So this is not so exceptional in that respect. It's exceptional in one respect only, and that's, of course, it's important, and that's my main point, of course, and my main point won't be so surprising. Because you see, there's one method that totalitarian, centralizing, statist dictatorships did in order to reduce human autonomy. But it seems that there are more ways to skin a cat than we thought previously. And this kind of disorderly, chaotic, improvised, capricious rule can do it too. How does it do it? Well, first, I mentioned uncertainty and dependence. And of course, all societies nowadays in the world are struggling with joblessness and as a result of technological changes, unemployment is becoming one of the most central aspects of social life. So dependence and uncertainty are important, but at the moment in Eastern Europe they are resolved, these problems, by mass immigration. People who would be unemployed otherwise will go, not for long because it won't be possible, but are still going to the West to try to find some employment. And there are other things as well. But the main, it doesn't matter. Yeah, and you see imposition of the ideology, the uncertainty, and the lack of the legal power of the state, you cannot be sure that there will be redress. You cannot be sure where to turn, where is state authority, what is the source of the public order. In such a state, this is hidden. This is hidden. Poor civil servants go from one speech of the ruler to the next to get oriented. And that means that those speeches and those interviews every Friday morning on state radio are the most important political acts. In a country where, of course, there are no free elections, because free elections can take place only when you have free media, and if the activity of opposition parties is unimpeded, and in most places, especially for the consumers of traditional media, radio, television, printed newspapers, mostly older people in the provinces, but they are the most assiduous voters, and not the young don't vote. And so, in the absence of a free press, of course, you don't have free elections. But anyway, the government, of course, is very popular because it's playing very sensitively and in this improvising fashion on the strings of the popular mood. And a scared society that is scared for its economic future, which cannot really identify the true character and the true center of its own national culture, can indeed, by this fear and uncertainty and disappointment, be inspired by this fear itself. Fear is mobilizing. And, the foreigners will come, the rich foreigners in the shape of the EU, the poor foreigners in the shape of the immigrants and the refugees and so on and so forth. Anyway, unknown, mysterious people exercising some sort of mysterious influence and representing a mysterious threat. This is enough for that 50% of the electorate that can give the government a 2/3 or 4/5 majority. So we'll have elections that will be formally legal, and votes will be counted. I don't think that electoral fraud plays a role. It's not even needed, but even if it were needed, I don't think that it's not the way in which these systems function. And so you see, the idea that these are centralizing statist dictatorship is false. The idea they are nationalists is false. They're ethnicists and not nationalists, and that's different. You see, ethnicism, as opposed to nationalism, is something new. Nationalism, in the 19th century, for example, in our area, tried to persuade and to win over people from the ethnic minorities to get assimilated and become Germans, become Hungarians, become Italians, become Poles. There was a deal, that was the liberal deal, liberal and nationalist deal of the 19th century, in exchange for you changing your mother tongue from Slovak to Hungarian and your name from Novotny to Nagy, you'll be a member. You'll be a member of the nation. You're okay. You just become one of us, and then you'll be one of us. Okay? That was not such a bad deal comparing to what had happened in the 20th century. But this is not it. Ethnic groups, well, look at Scotland, look at Catalonia, look at Kurdistan, look at Flanders, don't seem to be able to live any longer in any kind of supra-ethnic state. And so you see the capacity of nations to assimilate, to attract, to become large from small. But what was the element of nationalism in the 19th and early 20th centuries? Well, small dukedoms and baronies united into big states. That's the history of Italy, that's the history of Germany, that's the history of the Soviet Union, that's the history of Yugoslavia, that's the history of Czechoslovakia, etc., etc., and Romania, and so on. Well, this is not at all the case any longer. These super-ethnic state limits are being dissolved. And the latest example, I'm about to finish, these, capricious in keeping in this style that I have characterized. The latest outburst of this ethnic hatred is a very strange thing, which actually touches me personally too, so let me finish with this. The Hungarian government majority, it's a long story, I won't go into it, against the resistance of the Hungarian Socialist Party, has introduced a new legal institution years ago that gave Hungarian citizenship to ethnic Hungarians living in the neighboring countries in Romania and Serbia. Slovakia and Ukraine didn't allow this. And about 750,000 people have taken dual citizenship without residence. They remain there. They are not immigrants. They remain there. And they can, to a certain extent, every Hungarian citizen residing in Hungary has 2 votes in the elections, and these people have 1 vote. So they can participate in the political life of the country. Okay. This has been resisted by people in the Socialist Party. Okay. And it seemed to people who judge Eastern Europe by nationalism that this was an unpopular thing to resist this dual citizenship and voting rights for Transylvanian and Vojvodina Hungarians. But no, it isn't popular. It is extremely unpopular. Because today's Hungarian ethnicists don't consider Transylvanian and Vojvodina Hungarians to be Hungarians. If they don't pay, they shouldn't vote. That's today's mood and today's political culture. If they pay taxes in this country, they can vote. This is the opposite of the American thing. No taxation without representation. Well, there's no representation without taxation. And you see, it is a great hatred now in the public debate, in the social media, directed against Transylvanian Hungarians such as myself. But I live in Hungary, so I pay taxes in Hungary. Not much, because I don't earn much. So. But still I do. And you see, that has come as a surprise for people who are still judging contemporary world in terms of the past. This is not classical nationalism. It had nothing to do with it. And also, there was no, in Eastern Europe, nobody really appreciated or liked the gypsies. There's always been a group held in contempt, but mostly held in indifference in their little ghettos and in separate settlements. It was never an important topic of ethnic passion. And now it is. All of a sudden, because the assimilation deal didn't last, so all of a sudden people discover that there are some people who are not yet assimilated. And they cannot be assimilated because they're physically different. Because they are of a darker hue, they're visibly foreign. And different in many ways, of course, in many social and cultural ways. So all of a sudden it gets into the center of the national preoccupations of a large part of the population. That was never before the case. And you see, and this, and also the immigrant problem, has, for example, a very strange effect on the traditional, let's put it that way, fraught relationship with the Jews. On the one hand, it increases anti-Semitism, because the whole ethnic and racial hatred is increasing. But on the other hand, it doesn't, because Jews are assimilated Hungarian-speaking, patriotic, and white. And also part of the middle class. So, it's a very interesting double movement in this respect. So, for example, which wouldn't have been the case even, say, 15 years ago, that very strongly patriotic and ethnically committed people have been greeting sincerely and enthusiastically the visit of Benjamin Netanyahu in Hungary for the very simple reason that he too is against Muslims, against Arabs. So he's okay, hating the right people. And so, there are changes in these very important ethnic and national feeling, because you see, they do have an impact over what do we think who we are, what do we think is at the center of our national life and our national culture, what is the framework in which this national life is being lived, and the whole thing is in a permanent flux, and this permanent flux does not result in any very powerful and well-shaped political movement, because its goal and its opponent is elusive. It's elusive, it's fluid, it's flexible, it appears and disappears, it affirms and it denies, it's informal. How do you fight, in a political way, informal power? It is not corruption. This is what people say, in Romania and Hungary, that, there's great corruption. But there's not corruption if you put one important state asset into a private company in order to use it for political purposes. Of course, there's some theory too, where isn't. But that's not interesting, because that's quite general. That happens anywhere and everywhere. That's not important. What is important is that the state assets alienated and who are getting out from the framework of state assets and state property that can be treated in the prescribed way, legal way, they go somewhere, but they don't leave politics. They don't leave politics. This kind of power is, prosaic, elusive, extremely cunning, extremely flexible, extremely supple, and its secret is not found neither by political opponents, nor by professional analysts, not by journalists, and sometimes it seems to me not even by the government. Thank you.
Yes, Professor Tamás has agreed to answer questions.
If any.
If any, yes. And there's someone with the microphone here, if you want to raise your hand, please do. Yes.
Hi. Thanks. First, thank you for your point of view. I lived in Budapest for 4 years, in the time where Viktor Orban was elected. And actually, I have two questions. First, how do you see on a daily basis the influence of the government on the press and the media? Because, for example, I have a friend who is just one, who is a supporter of Mr. Orban. And, for example, he tells me things like, oh no, he's being criticized also in some press, so that's a proof. I mean, that's supposed to be a proof that medias are free and independent. And second question is, I felt there that there was kind of deep pessimism in the Hungarian culture or people. Just for example, if you take a look at your national anthem, it's not criticized, just something I noticed. So I just wanted to have your point of view about how this is going to finish, what's going to happen. Will populism continue to grow, or what's going to happen in your point of view?
Yes. Should I talk about?
Yes, you should. You have one, yes.
Yes, well, first I wouldn't use the term populism. I wrote a piece on open democracy. You can find it there. It's called The Mystery of Populism Finally Unveiled. And I don't think it exists. But that's just a terminological question. It's not important. As to the first, in a way, well, that's, again, you know, the whole system is very surprising. The Hungarian press, what remains of it, the independent press, is bold and very critical and even brutal. So, you know, I write to some mostly internet journals, and sometimes I'm myself raising my eyebrows about the articles I read next to mine. What the hell are these people doing? Really, very, very rough. But these are preaching to the converted. There's a little corner of the whole media landscape, and it's mostly, you know, 30 to 50 mostly Budapest middle-class people. And, you know, the younger have some organs of their own, let's put it that way. And most of it is apolitical anyway, but it shows a great disgust vis-à-vis the officialdom and so on and so forth. So in that respect, if you judge a press about its boldness, impertinence, arrogance, and bad manners, you know, then you have indeed free press in Hungary, because there you can find out a great deal of that, but that reaches very few people. There is one single effective opposition radio station in the whole country, and it broadcasts only in Budapest. There are hundreds and hundreds of radio stations, very important because people are driving a great deal and listening to radio. The same news programs broadcasted everywhere, because, you know, the official news agency offers its news packages free to all broadcasters. So local radio, pop radio, sports radio, etc. Local newspapers, regional, appear with the same front page, the same pictures. It's all centrally manufactured. So in that respect, you know, some part of the press, and that's the most influential among the influential people, provincial voters, over 50, that could be in North Korea. But other parts are not. Other parts are not. This is not a dictatorship. This is a very cunning, very interesting new system. As to your second question about pessimism, I don't think that's a national trait. Most nations are accusing themselves of that. And, you know, I've read, you know, in my life, disquisitions on these, you know, bad trait of the English, never to complain because of their passivity, because of their pessimism. Mustn't grumble, you know, that's the English device. Mustn't grumble, and you mustn't grumble because never anything happens, nothing will help, so what's the use? And also it's not manly to complain. You know. So all peoples are criticizing themselves in this manner, and it's never totally justified. And how long will it last? It will last for a long time, I suppose, this kind of system. This is due to a very large right-wing drive in every country. And I was just laughing the other day in Vienna, listening to a talk that said that after all this right-wing drive has been stopped, allegedly, in the Netherlands. Well, you know, if the Conservatives adopt the policies of the fascists and win the elections as a result, I don't consider that a great progress. Nor do I consider Monsieur Macron and his neo-Bonapartism as a great progress. Anyway, but whatever. But so there's indeed this trend. For many reasons, I cannot go into it, although it preoccupies me. I am a man of the left, and of course I'm preoccupied by this total defeat and near disappearance of the left everywhere. You know, that's the greatest defeat ever. And, well, except, of course, between 33 and 40, but that was different. There was a war going on, and civil and otherwise. And you see, And of course, it has to do with a generation of very gifted politicians. Mr. Orban is an extremely gifted politician. The Kaczynski brothers are extremely gifted politicians, and there are a number of others. And Putin is not bad. I mean, in a technical fashion, you know, and so on. But of course, he's different. And also, these rulers are different too, because you see, the Kaczynski brothers are sincerely religious, fanatically religious, poor people, and who are not interested in women. Well, of course, one of them is dead now, but you know, Mr. Kaczynski is not interested in women, not interested in song, and not interested in wine. Well, our leaders are different. But, I mean, but these are secondary things. These are just character things. The main thing is the enormous self-confidence that is inspired by the deep conviction that the West is finished, that we are coming. That's really, you know who is very interesting, nobody, my German friends wouldn't believe me, who is the most quoted author on the conservative side in Hungary? Well, it's Spengler. Of course, it's Oswald Spengler and none else. And not only because of the decline of the West and all that, which is, of course is a much more interesting book than people who haven't read it think, but also his book of Prussianism and socialism. This idea, that's the idea of the age. No left, no right. Do you know who were the people who said ni droite ni gauche? But of course, that was the Action Française, the pre-fascists in France. And, you know, there was this person, Jean Paulhan and others, said this in France, you know, that whoever says that there is no essential difference between right and left, he is on the right. And that's a very good rule of thumb. But this is indeed an age in which some sort of synthesis between left and right, and not the most savory versions of it, are approaching. That was the slogan, and that is the slogan from Macron to Orban, and from Geert Wilders to Alexander Vucic, etc., of everybody. And this is based on the idea that the great cleavages and political ideas and political traditions of the West, liberalism versus conservatism, left versus right, state interference versus the market, oh, rubbish. And the rubbish of the past. It's all gone. And is replaced by ruthless energy, by conquest by men who don't have rationalistic political ideas. This is an unphilosophical political culture everywhere. I mean, look at the alt-right in the United States. The main reproach against liberals and the left is that they believe in ideas instead of believing in life. We've heard that before, but yes, in the 1920s. But this is not the same thing. You know, it is similar. It is similar ideologically to the extreme right of late 1920s, described by Fritz Stern in his, the 19th century, in his famous book, The Politics of Cultural Despair, and so on and so forth. But there's a difference. What don't we have, for example, in Hungary and in Poland, is a totalitarian, fanatical mass movement. The fanatical groups are still small groups, and they can be found in any country. That's one thing. Second, people are not in prison. They're not punished. We don't have Gestapo, we don't have concentration camps, we don't have prisons. I can come here, rubbish my government, and go home and be okay. Well, I won't have a job, but you can't have everything. But still, I mean, compared to Turkey, you know, in Turkey, not that I would be in prison, but I would never have left prison. And, you know, and nor would I be, probably I wouldn't be alive in Russia. But this is not the same system. It's not the same system. And it's not only that the support for our rulers is genuine, for the Kaczynski government and for Orban and for others, for Vucic, who's a very important player, don't forget him, and so on, but also because it seems to be adequate and, as it were, these people seem to express what people feel with a combination of disorder, of sentiment, of fear, of pride, of dignity, and hatred. These are feelings. They're not political doctrines. But they're very well expressed and quite sincerely sometimes. So this is going to last. What kind of a state, what kind of a culture, what kind of a society will this political arrangement build? I cannot tell. I have my misgivings about it, but for the moment, I cannot tell.
Thank you. Other questions? Yes, please.
My replies will be short.
Thank you very much for very interesting ideas. I have two questions. First, you talked a lot about this infamous, not very well-known ruling group. Who are they? Does one know who they are?
No. Then I didn't express myself correctly.
But let me just, and then you can. So it would be interesting to know who they are, and even if the opposition newspaper media is not that strong in terms of not reaching so many people, they should be able to find out, and they should start working on that. So that was one question: is how does this work? Secondly, and this is now going beyond Hungary. You started your talk really about Orbán being, he thinks that he's leading a new wave in the world. And when you listen to what you said about many of the things that he's doing, that Kaczynski is doing and the others, you see the same thing with Trump and many other countries. So my question is, how do you see the Western world in 20 years from now?
So to the first question, no, this informal group is identical with the former leading group. That's interesting about it. It's a dual function. It's a dual function. Well, Mr. Orban himself is a duly elected, legally elected prime minister, the head of the executive power in Hungary. That's, nobody doubts that. And, but the method of governing, that's not mysterious. All these things are well known. How do I know it? From the newspapers, as you say. This is how I know it. But, of course, it's a new method of governing, and it's also, of course, it's unconstitutional. It is unconstitutional, but nobody can be bothered by that. Because of the spirit of the age, you see. It's not because people are scared. Some are, some aren't, but that's not important. But, but believing in pieces of paper? Who believes today in pieces of paper? It's unconstitutional to have, political power amassed outside legal boundaries. That's unconstitutional. Of course it is. It doesn't seem to be important. Nobody's really objecting. Nobody's really understanding what the press, the opposition press, for example, is interested in. How much of these huge state assets go actually in the private pockets of some politicians, which is the most trivial, most uninteresting, and most unimportant aspect of the whole thing. The system is not especially corrupt. These things are preserved in order to govern the state, even if the government is not a government any longer. These people will rule Hungary, well, not as exclusively as now, even they, by some accident, lose the elections, which cannot happen, but, but accidents, of course, shit happens. But that's always. And it's a very, very interesting situation. It's a very interesting situation. And which doesn't mean that, some classical onslaughts on the rule of law and the legal state are not happening. Of course, But these are not so interesting, not so original. Of course, the Orban government, the Kaczynski government, etc. government, everybody, everywhere, are trying to influence the courts. We have our methods similar to Poland, to Israel, to Russia. Others have other methods. And don't think for a moment that a Tory government is not trying to influence the BBC. There have been great personal changes. Now, I know people on the Austrian radio and television. These people are scared to death. They know perfectly well that with the FPÖ and the Austrian government, there will be significant changes. It's not a rarity, but I didn't emphasize the things that go on everywhere. And that gets me to your second question, what's going on everywhere? Yes, we have this kind of right-wing advance, which also in the case of Trump, has a very strong informal character. Hundreds of important and decisive government jobs are unfilled, as you know. 52 ambassadorial posts are not filled. It has never happened in history. The state is, to a certain extent, led by Mr. Trump and his daughter and his son-in-law. And this is not because he wants to found a dynasty and he rules like Caligula. It doesn't at all. These are perfectly gemütlich, people of New York. But certainly the rule is informal. And, ruling by Twitter, by rubbishing your foreign secretary in public, and then nothing happens. He doesn't resign, nor is he fired by the president. What the hell is going on? Well, nothing special is going on, but governance, as we have known it, doesn't exist any longer. And very similar phenomena of one kind or another are reinforcing informality or dispensing with guarantees. You see in the case of France, in which the ultra-majority of M. Macron assures him of ruling like Orban with decrees because there's no resistance. The average time in Hungary in the 1990s, when our parliamentary system started, to pass a law was 3 months. Now it's 24 hours. It's propounded, it's voted, end of story. It's not because there's tyranny. It's a parliament, but it's not parliamentary. There's no energy, there's no patience, there's nothing. Also, it can be done because the bylaws have been changed. But these bylaws have been changed without any significant protest. You know very well that in any parliamentary system, the house rules of parliament, are extremely important, sometimes as important as the constitution. I've been a member of this parliament myself, but only for 4 years, and in the best times, 89 to 94. And even then, we had very, very absurd house rules. And I tried to interest but that was a democratic system. I tried to interest my fellow MPs in that. I said, you can be robbed of your parliamentary rights just like this, if we are not anchored, in very detailed, specific parliamentary rules, like it's done, of course, in Westminster, which, of course, it's our exemplar still of parliamentary procedure, and the American Senate too, actually. No, there was no interest, but this is coming everywhere. It's coming everywhere. So I think that we are witnessing a not so slow decomposition of the mechanics of power in liberal capitalist states that are not totally changing their character, but the spirit of it is changing visibly and deeply. And you know very well, because also in the 18th century, the great thinkers and politics have always described that the manners are important. The way in which Mr. Trump speaks, and other politicians today, the Boris Johnsons of this world and others of this kind, shows that the state, the arcana imperii, don't have an authority any longer. It is not considered to be majestic, it's not considered to be dignified. The public affairs, the common good, the public interest are not any longer, don't seem to be any longer part of our civic religion. So, yeah.
Okay. There's a question here.
Thank you very much for the brilliant insights. You have been talking about central planning. So I wonder if you think that the rise of new information technologies and big data, do they promise any more? Do they promise a more egalitarian future for us at all? Would they make central planning easier in some ways?
Well, the jury is still out about that. And I have no independent views. I'm just reading about it myself, sometimes alarmed, sometimes hopeful. There's one limit that is not technological and is not technical to any kind of reasonable and planned state interference, for example, in the interests of equality and fairness and equity and so on. And that, you know, is the extent of our belief in reason. And there I don't think that we're doing a great job. And, you know, the rejection of the enlightenment, well, I live in this era too, and I reject it to a certain extent, and it has been abused in the most horrendous manner. And I'm not in favor of, you know, natural science models being applied to everything. Of course not. Nevertheless, science and the philosophical idea of an approximation of truth, even if that's a matter of controversy and debate, has been a part of the Western culture in the last 3,000 years, and it served us relatively well. A total relativism and total skepticism and total uncertainty and a total abandonment of hope about being able to find truth, but not to be possessing truth and all those absolutist, positivist things that, of course, we reject and repudiate rightly. That seems to be missing. So we have the same kind of enormous scientific and cultural and technological development without the state of mind in which at first they had been developed. So something has changed. You know, in the first great industrial revolution and technological development, there was this, optimism, these ideas of progress, of development, of evolution, etc., etc. They have been partly rejected because of its lack of being realized. But now, it seems to me that's directionless. And the same hopes are not attached to this kind of development. That I can observe. But what will come of it, I'm as ignorant as most people, so I cannot give you, and it would be noble to give you just a verbal and rhetorical answer, masquerading as a real reply, which I don't have.
Thank you. Yes, there are a few more questions. Let's take two more questions. One, two, yes.
I'm kind of interested in the parallels with Trump, yes. And I think the ethnicism rather than nationalism applies there as well. But the question I'd like to ask is, perhaps following up from what you just said, is that fake news is very important there, the idea of fake news. And that has two aspects to it. And one is that politicians can lie, they can be exposed as lying, and then it has no reputational effects. And then the other aspect of it is there are fake stories which are being propagated, and they are accepted as being true. So I'm wondering if those phenomena are happening in the new Central Europe.
Right. I have an essay that's published in English. It's called Ethnicism After Nationalism. It's published in Social Register. That's a small yearbook of the Canadian-British left, and but it still appears. So I described that theoretically. I won't go into all that. This is why I dared to mention it. Yes, it is quite true that since the New Deal, and even before, but since the New Deal massively, American nationalism, American patriotism was increasingly inclusive. Well, that's a commonplace, but it happens to be true. And as this is not any longer the case, as indeed the racial prejudices play a role in mainstream politics again, which hasn't been the case for a long time now, and it seems to people have the impression that it has always been there. Well, that's not true ever in politics, because in politics it's only there what appears. In politics, to distinguish between appearance and essence is an impossible enterprise, and I won't even try. So, so there, yes. So, when indeed that kind of talk that is nowadays permitted, vis-à-vis blacks, vis-à-vis immigrants, vis-à-vis gays, vis-à-vis women, etc., or nowadays even Native Americans, for God's sake, yesterday. But if that is possible, if that is accepted, and that means that the whole development of ideas according to which Americans, sometimes mendaciously, sometimes sincerely, seemed to shape their national life and to fight with their enemies, that seems to be gone. This is not the consensus of 1945. Nowhere, actually. There was a consensus that, of course, is embodied by the UN, embodied by a number of institutions and of convictions and of institutions, from the Marshall Plan to the idea of introducing democracy everywhere, 89, etc., etc. All this seems to be gone. And America was, of course, one of the most important players and elements in all this, and it doesn't seem to be on the side of democracy. Indeed, if it comes to the crunch. So that's at least emotionally. Well, the institutions still exist, and of course, America is still a free country in the way in which it was. And the fake news thing is, again, something that has been called in the 1920s and 30s, rather more grandiloquently, myth. I mean, how many books there are treating the extreme right developments in interwar Europe by believing in myth, by replacing reason with mythology, etc., etc. But of course, a myth is different from another kind of statement that it enjoys authority, it cannot be questioned, and believing it or not is not a question of cognition, but it's a question of emotion. So if you don't believe in my myth, it doesn't mean that you are in error, but you are dissing me. You are showing me disrespect. You are not understanding me, and you might hate me. You might hate me. Because the myth is my kind of story. So, calling it fake news and fake stories is a very characteristically contemporary lowering of intensity and of rhetoric. When people, instead of saying, this is intolerable tyranny, will say, this is shit. That's a style of the age. But it doesn't mean that it's different. Essentially, it is absolutely identical with what we witnessed between the two world wars, when indeed people, in the name of feeling, of intuition, of the heart, would say that your dry and cold, rationalistic, alleged truth are not valuable. You might check facts, but you don't have a feeling for essences. Well, this is exactly what you have. This has always been. Well, where does it come from? From Romanticism. Romanticism has always been the great inspiration behind the radical right. Now, this is no different today.
There was a last question here. Yes.
No, I was just wondering if you could, if you could talk a little about the role of intellectuals and academics on all of it. To what extent are we preaching to the choir, like you said, or what is the best strategy for academics, I guess, in the most pragmatic way?
Yes, I know. No, I'm just hesitating what to answer. This is why I'm scratching in my head. Well, you know, there are systems that need intellectuals, and in which the work of intellectuals is of central importance. So were, paradoxically, as I mentioned it, the state socialist systems, where there was no real ruling class in the style of a capitalist state, but there was a class that commanded authority, and that was the intellectuals. And the intellectuals, as such, of course, come from the left. You know that. Of course, you know that. You know, the term intellectual comes from France, and it first designated the intellectual supporters of the Dreyfusard side in the great debates of the second half of the 19th century in France, the Dreyfus trial. Now, and of course the Russian intellectuals, who were also people committed to the cause of the people. There's not a professional designation. Intellectuals are not academics. Some of them may be academics, but you know, it's not identical. And we still have this idea of intellectuals. It's disappearing very fast, but we still have that. And in a way that, of course, involves public responsibilities, what's called in English-speaking countries a public intellectual. Well, all intellectuals are public intellectuals. That's its very definition. But you know, it's and in this kind of system, as I attempted to describe, in of course a very brief and superficial way, intellectuals just now are losing their importance. Not only their jobs, also their importance. They don't command the authority they did. And there are famous artists and thinkers, but they are famous because they appear on television and they say something. It's not because of their works, because people, of course, won't read serious books as much as they have been doing in the times of old. But apart from the sociological and other things, what intellectuals are doing today is mostly falling silent. This has its own ideology, anti-politics, being apolitical, politics is dirty, we have nothing to do with power, you know. That has always been the case. I just wrote an essay about the origins of this idea in the Stoic philosophy. That's where it comes from the Stoics. They said that, you know, don't care about the emperors, don't care about power, look into yourself and look at nature. That's the oldest recipe there is. Yeah? So we are getting there. We're getting there very, very fast. I have lots of intellectual acquaintances who refuse to read a newspaper. Not only that they won't participate in political life, but refuse even to be informed. That's not the majority yet, but more and more people are like that, especially the young. And so they are becoming academics, specialists, also, you know, pursuing various interesting and elusive and rare problems. There's pleasure in that, and there's beauty in that. I won't deprecate it. But the old intellectual role is disappearing, but it's disappearing everywhere again. But we might have a greater need of them than other people in more fortunate, wealthier, and more peaceful countries, maybe. But But even, can you imagine that today people like Jean-Paul Sartre or Herbert Marcuse would be possible, imaginable, to have somebody like Louis Althusser being an incomprehensible theorist, calling the shots in Paris? Unthinkable. And so on and so forth. But think of isolated private people like Nietzsche, who after all influenced the fate of the world. Or, just the practicing Vienna doctor called Sigmund Freud. Such people are sociologically impossible, are becoming sociologically impossible, more and more. There are a few exceptions, but not real exceptions. And although we would need that, because you see intellectuals with all their crimes and sins and deficiencies and so on and so forth, and they're sermonizing, that's one of my faults too, preaching, they still were useful in offering words to people who weren't themselves wordsmiths to formulate their problems and create also a cultural community in which debate, in which conversation was possible. But as conversation is falling off, so are intellectuals. It's not one is causing the other. They are happening concomitantly. What will replace this? What will replace anything? Where is the revolutionary working class, for God's sake? Where is it? Where is the revolutionary proletariat? Where is the Bildungsbürgertum? All those human groups that have determined public life, even in my youth, it was already the fag end of it all, but still, are disappearing fast. And nothing is to replace them. And most certainly, university bureaucrats and research apparatchiks won't do it. Because they can't. It's not unthinkable that somebody during the day will be a research apparatchik and in the evening, burning the night oil, will write some immortal manifestos that will inspire coming generation. I don't believe in it somehow, but maybe I'm mistaken.
Thank you. We have reached the end of our conversation with Professor Tamás, and I thank him in your name and in mine, and we hope to see you again.
Thank you.